I have spent my life as an avid bookworm committing one of the great cardinal sins of literature, especially considering the fact that I am an intersectional feminist who does her best to read widely and to promote fiction by writers of colour, queer writers across the entire spectrum, and people who are generally underrepresented. My great mistake, that has just been ongoing until now, was not reading Octavia Butler. For as long as I can remember, I've been a fan of science fiction, and as I said, I'm constantly doing my best to be an intersectional feminist who reads widely and decolonizes her bookshelf. And yet I'm a walking, talking hypocrite because I'd never read one of the great writers of 20th century America, one of the great writers of science fiction, one of the great black female voices in literature, Octavia E. Butler. So I fixed it. I read Kindred. Finally. In case you've also never read Octavia Butler, she was an incredible writer who managed to stitch science fiction into enormous thematic talking points regarding race, gender, power. Octavia Butler's books can be talked about within the realm of science fiction, and they can also be talked about within the realm of literary books about important political points, given the fact that she was a black woman writing in the 1970s and beyond. This means that she's a valuable and important voice in 20th century American literature, and also someone who was pushing the science fiction genre forward. Kindred, for example, is a work of time travel science fiction. Our protagonist, Dana, is a black woman living in California. She and her white husband, Kevin, have just moved into a new house, and the two of them are now both writers. We learn a little bit later on about how they met, and early on we see an image of their new house. It is full of books, and they are both so proud of their work as writers. But suddenly, Dana is disappeared from this plane. She vanishes out of thin air, and she reawakens 150 years in the past. She doesn't realize this at first. She just sort of gets a headache, the room starts spinning, and then when she opens her eyes, she's at the edge of a lake or a river, and there is a red-headed white boy drowning. And so she jumps in and she saves him. When she pulls him out of the water, a white man is pointing a shotgun at her. She is staring down the barrel of this gun, and then suddenly she vanishes again, and she's back where she was, in her home in 1976. What I'm about to tell you is what Dana discovers very early on in the book and in pretty quick succession. First, the place that she travels to is 1815, a plantation in Maryland. The boy that she saved is called Rufus, and she learns that he is in fact one of her ancestors. He will end up having a child with one of his family's slaves. And for some reason, Dana and Rufus, her ancestor, are tethered together. Any time that Rufus is in danger, Dana is pulled back from the present to the past to save his life and keep him safe. But the only way that she can be thrown back to her present is if her life is suddenly in danger. Like, for example, if a shotgun is being pointed at her by a scary white man. And so from here, there is a back and forth. Dana is yanked back in time to help Rufus, and then thrown back to the present. However, time isn't equal in both of these places. When Dana first gets thrown back, she mentions to her husband, Kevin, that she was gone for quite a few minutes as she jumped in the water and saved this kid. But Kevin says that she was only gone for a few seconds. So seconds in the present are minutes in the past. Minutes in the present are hours in the past, and so on. So you immediately realize, okay, if she were to get stuck in the past for a year, not that much time would actually pass in the present. And so suddenly she will have aged. And this is important. But time is always moving forward wherever on the timeline you are. So when she's back in the present for maybe a day or a week, Rufus, back in the past, is aging far more quickly. So the second time she goes back, he's quite a few years older. He's now a teenager. And the third time she goes back, she accidentally ends up bringing her husband Kevin with her. And the two of them are stuck there for a while. In 1976, you have a black woman married to a white man. In 1815, she is interpreted to be his slave, and he her owner. So Dana and Kevin have a lot to figure out. Why is she being pulled back? And how do they get this to stop? The fact is, Rufus is not very bright. He's reckless, and he keeps getting himself in trouble. And every time he's near death, Dana has to come in and save him. All the while putting herself at risk and having to figure out how to fit into this society when her only option is to be a slave. And as the story goes on, Dana, kind of unfortunately, has to build a relationship with this kid Rufus. They become friends of a sort. When he's young, she reads him bedtime stories. As he gets older, she has to wrestle with the fact that he is his father's son, and he is behaving in a brutal, frightening, monstrous way. Rufus is an example of the brutality of white patriarchy, and Dana has somehow ended up becoming his black female guardian angel. This dynamic is uncomfortable and striking. And Kevin, Dana's husband, who is a decent guy, is struggling with the role that he suddenly has to kind of perform as well. Kindred is a lot of things. It asks us to look the past in the eye and consider how far we've come, how far we haven't come, what remains of that brutality of white patriarchy. And the answer is a lot. But we also have a black woman from the 1970s who is going back 150 years into her past, into her country's past, into her culture's past, and learning things about black history that she herself doesn't know. Quite often you see jokes on the internet about what it would be like if you lived in a certain time period. You hear white people say, oh, I'd love to live back in the Victorian period or the 1950s, and then black people stitch that TikTok to explain why that wouldn't be so great for them. This book is that. As a white person, I'm certainly not fit to talk about a lot of the themes in here. There are going to be things that I will be completely ignorant of. Also, being British, there are certain aspects of American history that I don't know. But I think what struck me hardest in Kindred is the brutality. Kindness remains in this book. Kindness from Dana's perspective and Kevin's, and a few other characters as well. There is this kind of dim light glowing in the background all the time as hope and the potential for growth and change, these things remain just softly glowing. But at the forefront is brutality, fear, abuse, all the things that you would come to expect from a slave narrative from the early 19th century on a plantation. For an author in the 1970s to use the historically white male-dominated genre of science fiction to explore vital issues of race, sex, and power and patriarchy, it's incredibly powerful stuff. What Octavia Butler did for science fiction cannot be understated. But science fiction has always been a genre that has pointed out disgusting political acts and behaviours and ideals and philosophies, etc. War of the Worlds was written in the early 20th century by a white British man, but it is an anti-colonialist book. And that's one example of thousands. I'm very proud of the genre of science fiction. It does a lot of good, using metaphors and concepts and pretty exciting places and times to explore very, very important political ideas, to highlight hypocrisies, etc. And now that I've read Kindred, I can see that few people have done it even half as well as Octavia Butler. A woman who is, as I said, using science fiction to explore the themes of power, patriarchy, white privilege, and colonial oppression. It's incredibly moving stuff. I've got The Parable of the Sower ready to go. I'm going to be reading that soon. And I know that's the first half of a duology, so then I've got even more to go, and great. She's an incredibly empathetic writer who is talking about very, very big things, but in a wonderfully intimate way. I am so glad I finally read Kindred and fixed my mistakes, at least in part. So keep reading intersectionally. Keep reading authors from throughout history who have been marginalized, especially within genre fiction. There's a lot to be said for the power of women's voices, black voices, etc. within genres that are historically white male dominated, like fantasy and science fiction. What authors like N.K. Jemisin are doing right now for fantasy, Octavia Butler did for science fiction 50 plus years ago. What an incredible woman. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week, and this one sounds awesome, and it's also a book I'd never heard of until this moment. This recommendation comes from Christiana Nedelcu, and the book is Mrs. March by Virginia Fato. Christiana said it's a gripping novel of one woman's descent into neuroticism as she struggles with the release of her husband's new novel. It's a great combination of paranoia, horror, and dark humor. It's great seeing the story unfold and the slow uncovering of secrets from the past. Loved it. I wish I could wipe it from my memory and read it again for the first time. Anytime a book has that exact effect, and I think we've all read books that we wish we could just forget and reread again for the first time, that's always a wonderful sign. So thank you, Christiana. That's awesome. I can't wait to check this out. If you'd like to recommend me books that I will read out in videos like this one, consider joining my Patreon. I would really, really appreciate it. And subscribe for books.